So you're hearing a lot today about different inventions and new ideas that are going on at MIT. And what I want to tell you about today is some of my research, which is trying to ask the question, what inventions are we missing? And so I work in particular on medical innovation and thinking about new kinds of healthcare technologies that bring value to patients. And so when you ask medical doctors or ask biologists or other basic scientists what determines what kinds of medical technologies get developed, they often give you a very standard answer, which is that, well, what matters is breakthroughs in basic science. Those are undoubtedly extremely important, but as an economist, my role is to basically come in and ask about what are the roles of market incentives in determining what types of scientifically feasible technologies actually make the transition from a scientist's lab to actually treating and benefiting patients. And so we can ask questions like, why don't we have an HIV vaccine? Why don't we have a cure for cancer? And it could just be that the science of those challenges is too hard. But my job in my research essentially tries to ask, maybe we don't have a cure for cancer because there aren't a lot of incentives for either private research investments or publicly funded research investments to be working on certain problems. And is there a way that we can better design public policies in order to align the private rewards that firms get or the private rewards that scientists would get working in universities to coming up and developing a cure for cancer in a way that's more commensurate with the social contributions of those technologies? And so today I'm going to tell you about one example of my research, which is trying to get at the question of what cancer drugs are we missing. And so it's easiest to highlight this with an example. If you look at over the last 5 years, the cancer drugs that have been approved by the US Food and Drug Administration to treat lung cancer, there have been 8 such drugs approved. All of them treat a very late stage of lung cancer, known as metastatic lung cancer. So metastatic means that the cancer is spread beyond the initial tumor to other parts of the body. And at that stage, the cancer is much harder to manage, and patients have much shorter expected lifespans. So all 8 of those drugs were approved to treat these very late-stage, relatively sick patients with poor survival prospects. One example that's relatively well-known is Genentech has a drug called Avastin, which was shown in a randomized clinical trial that it increased patient survival time from just over 10 months to just over 12 months. So there is a benefit to these drugs, but it's relatively incremental and for a very relatively unhealthy group of patients. In contrast, there's never been any drug approved to treat lung cancer, and in fact, across all cancers, there's only been 6 drugs approved to treat any form of cancer. And so basically, I was interested in trying to understand why is that the case. And so it could just be that drugs to treat early stage cancer are just really scientifically challenging to come up with. But what we were interested in looking at is a different possibility, which is that private firms may underinvest in drugs to treat early stage cancers because the time lag that is required to actually document evidence that those drugs benefit patients is much longer than it is for these later stage cancers. And so 2 examples will sort of highlight what we have in mind here. So these are 2 clinical trials for drugs to treat prostate cancer. The first drug treats metastatic prostate cancer, which again are relatively sicker prostate cancer patients. The 5-year survival rate for those patients is on the order of about 20%. The second is a clinical trial that is for a drug treating localized prostate cancer patients. So localized means that the cancer is confined to the tumor still in the prostate. It hasn't spread to any surrounding organs, and the cancer can usually be treated much more successfully. And so the 5-year survival rate for that patient group is about 80%. And so if you look at these two clinical trials, both of them, they administered a treatment in a randomized controlled trial to a treatment group and followed up how did the treatment group do in terms of improved survival relative to a comparison group. And so for the first trial, they administered the treatment and they followed up both groups for a median of just over 1 year. And in total, taking into account patient recruiting and other time costs, that trial lasted about 3 years. The second clinical trial, they administered the treatment, and they needed to follow the treatment and control group for just about 9 years in order to show that the drug improved survival. So why is that? These patients just are going to live longer because they have better survival prospects. So if you write down a standard statistical power calculation, how long is it going to take you to show a statistically significant difference between survival in the treatment and control group? It's going to take you a much longer period of time. And you can see that just in terms of how much longer the trial had to be to show a statistically significant improvement in patient survival. And so taken together with longer times for patient recruitment, the second trial lasted about 18 years. And so if you look at private firms' incentives to come in and develop drugs to treat localized prostate cancer and metastatic prostate cancer, you can see that the time horizons required to develop those different drugs are just starkly different. And that matters both because firms may be less willing to make investments in drugs that require a long time to complete, but it also matters because firms almost always file for patent protection before they start their clinical trials. And so basically every day that you spend in clinical trials is one less day that you have a patent once your drug is on the market that you're able to make profits off of your medication. And so in this case, for the first trial, all patents last 20 years. For the first drug, you would get 17 years of effective patent life, whereas for the second drug, you would get 2 years. And so the system of public policies we have in place actually bias us against having private firms come in and try to develop drugs to treat these localized prostate cancer patients. And so consistent with that time lag inducing a distortion in private R&D investment, the first trial for these metastatic prostate cancer patients was privately funded by a small biotech company, whereas the second trial was actually funded by the public sector. And so what I've done in some of my research is to try to look at not examples, but rather a representative set of all of the clinical trials that have been funded since 1970, which is when the US National Cancer Institute started collecting this type of data. And what we did is we tried to document causal evidence that actually, if we had shorter clinical trials, it looks like we would discover missing drugs. So we would have drugs that would be developed, and we estimate that would actually benefit patients in terms of improving their health relative to what we would have with these longer clinical trials. And then we analyze various public policy responses, like reforms to the patent system, that you could use to try to address this distortion in practice. So that just gives you some flavor of the kind of research that we're doing over in economics, which people often see as sort of the social sciences being somewhat separate from the rest of campus. And I hope that gives you a flavor of actually how the work that I do really is informed by a lot of close collaboration with people in other disciplines around the Institute. So economists sort of go on record saying we don't want to predict the future, but just to end, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the scientific and engineering challenges are things that we need to have collaborations between scientists and social scientists to try to solve. And so advances in science and engineering, I think, can create new policy challenges that create room for economists and other social scientists to make a contribution. But on the flip side, I think the role of economics can really be helpful in improving the design of public policies and to make it so that we have more opportunity to discover these missing inventions that could have a lot of benefits for individuals. So thank you very much.